Hey, Louise.
Hi. I think it gave us extra time, Peter.
Okay. There's a clock here. Well, I think that I want to begin by just saying thank you for that amazing reading.
Well,
And I felt the urge to clap at the moment when somebody else did in the audience that was early. Not because I thought it was over, but because it was just so moving.
oh, well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
I want to begin by asking you something about the way you structure your work. And I'll want to open the question by talking about your poem, The Story of a Day, which appears in your most recent book, Faithful and Virtuous Night. So for those of you who don't know this poem, to paraphrase it, which is a sort of a sin, but just to give you a bit of a frame for it, it opens with the speaker, who I will call she, although it could easily be he.
Yeah.
Right? But for the ease of conversation, I'll say she. Viewing light coming through blinds in a room. She then, during the day, finds herself at a narrow table where she works, language filling her head, until it is nighttime.
Those were the good old days.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Then she goes outside. It's nighttime. She walks the streets, thinking. She comes back home, and it is morning. She's in the same room, and she raises the blinds. The poem ends. It's beautiful.
It would make a wonderful film, don't you think?
Yeah. So before she steps into her home, though, she stands on the stoop, refusing to unlock the door. I'm going to quote here. I closed my eyes. I was torn between a structure of oppositions and a narrative structure. So I wanted to ask you about that dilemma.
Yeah.
The dilemma makes me think about the structure of many of your books. I think about what I referred to earlier as the sort of like dialectical thought in your work.
Yeah.
The structure of opposites, the way that's happening, for instance, in a village life through conversation between husband and wife, in some moments, or between like the human voices and the non-human voices, the bats and the worms, for instance, who speak in counterpoint to the human point of view in a village life, or the fantastic revelation, the sort of plotting of the life of your sort of the main speaker of Faithful and Virtuous Night. So I wonder if you could just say something about those lines and that kind of dilemma.
I can try.
Yeah.
The poem was a great problem. Lots of people, lots of reliable, trusted readers did not like it a whit. I should say first, it's very curious the way an I works, because it's not gendered. And English is wonderful in the genderlessness of some of the things that can be done on the page. I mean, I suppose that's always true of I, but I think of this, there's a kind of artifice in this poem that I think of as emanating from, or a branch of, a tangent of the male gay painter who dominates. And I don't know that it's essential to think of this in one or another way, but the poem got written out of this sort of fantasy of a male, and not actually a male, not like a football player kind of male, more like a failed guy. The sort that I would be were I a boy. I had those lines very early, and I wanted to get them into the book. And this was very, very long poem originally, and it got pared down and pared down and pared down, and then it became willfully cryptic, and even its defender didn't like it anymore, so I had to introduce more. I cannot remember exactly how it was written, but I wanted to use those lines. I thought, that they suggested a kind of dichotomy that I hadn't seen talked about. And in a way, what I was learning how to do in the later stages, or the most recent late stages of my writing life, was to learn narrative, because I'd always written in oppositions. And I think if you look at my early work, the poems are very static. They're these frozen, sometimes quite pretty lyric moments. But if an arm goes up, it never comes down. I literally did not know how to get an arm to move. And I had to teach myself how to do that. And then I wanted something that would, in a way, combine the two. I don't know that I think this is, I'm glad that you single it out because it's had so few friends. But I don't know what I make of it, really. I think it cheats a bit. I mean, you don't.
Well,
Good.
I mean, only in the best way, maybe. Yeah.
Well.
Yeah. In a sort of like, if cheating can be a kind of magic.
There is one line. There is a line I like. This is the third section, the really exciting plot development, in which the speaker is sitting at the table. Long into the night I sat brooding at my table until my head was so heavy and empty I was compelled to lie down. But I did not lie down. Instead, I rested my head on my arms, which I had crossed in front of me on the bare wood. Like a fledgling in a nest, my head lay on my arms. I thought that was very funny. I mean, and it's completely nonsensical. So there were these moments that I came on, but I really felt that the structuring of that poem was done with it was tremendously effortful, and I feel it's the kind of thing that you could have handled better, actually. In any case, I wanted it to proceed as narrative, that is, things happened in a sequence, but I also wanted that sense of nothing moved. Everything was, the energy came from oppositions, and the sort of calling into existence of different points of view simultaneously.
You're speaking of the poem.
Yeah.
What would you say about the book, like in terms of like how it works vis-a-vis that dilemma? I guess I think it in some ways does both.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, I had originally thought it was going to be just the long poems in the voice. There's this painter voice who makes his first appearance in the title poem. He is remembering infancy, or he's possibly 2, 3 years old, lying, he's an orphan, in a bed next to his brother, and the brother is reading a book about King Arthur, which he describes to the speaker. And the speaker hears for a faithful and virtuous knight, describing one of the knights of the Round Table. The speaker thinks that it's N-I-G-H-T. And this was written very early, this poem, and it was like nothing I had ever written, but it was like a great deal that Iris Murdoch has written in her quite miraculous novels. I felt myself enormously influenced by those, which I have read many, many, many times. But then it turned out that the book wouldn't work that way. I mean, when I put together all these sections, first of all, it was extremely short for a book and very long for a poem. But it was also leaden, I thought. When they were all together, it seemed simply like a bravura piece. There was no air in it, there was no movement, it seemed contrived. And so then I had to figure out ways of aerating this leaden narrative. So there were all of these little tangent poems, surreal, more and more surreal, compared to anything that I'd ever done before, wildly surreal, though compared to a real surrealist, very doggedly literal. But, and the writing of the book was moving from these long monologues to sectioned poems that were unrealistic, to prose poems that were really unrealistic. And once I wrote the prose poems, I could begin to see how the book could be organized, and I was enormously relieved because I didn't know how to. I mean, a lot of things that you do because you're trying to figure out a tactic which will let you save work that you love. Peter has a very long, meditative, narrative poem that in its present, its final version is much shorter than the original. Yeah. But it was a way of trying to realize what the ambition of that original very, very long thing was, but to make it speak more potently. And I think always what I feel like I'm doing is trying to rescue one beautiful stanza that is sort of homeless, and I have to find a context in which that stanza can speak. I mean, don't look at me as though you're fascinated by this. You can't be.
Do you want to move slightly to a different?
Yes, let's do.
Yeah. I want to ask a question about another kind of poem that you may have just alluded to that appears in Faithful and Virtuous Knight, but also in A Village Life and in other work of yours. And I think of it as a sort of mode of yours that I find really mysterious. It's a kind of poem where you are breaking rules, that I think are, and the way you manage it is astounding to me. And I'm thinking about the balance between what we think of as the image, which is language, which when we read it, we experience through our senses, and abstraction, or words that speak to the world of the mind.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, and so the very first two poems in Faithful and Virtuous Night are very stark in their imagery and very rich in abstract language, And I also think of a poem like The Crossroads, which you read, which ends in that beautiful image of the speaker touching her body with her hand. But before that, speaks almost exclusively in abstract terms. And I wonder, as a teacher, what do you tell your students when you're, because like the poem that's filled with abstract ideas like the heart and my love and my soul are often kinds of poems that you, for a young writer, you want to say, we need to see something.
Yeah.
We need to feel something here.
Yeah.
Like with our bodies. We need to have our bodies involved in our reading experience, And neuroscience tells us now that when we see a dance move across the stage, mirror neurons in our minds are firing as if we ourselves were doing that, And I think a similar sort of experience happens reading a poem that involves that kind of sensual language. But you managed to make something else happen with the way you handle abstraction. And I just wondered if you have anything that you could say about that.
I can talk about teaching more easily because I love it, and I spent a certain amount of time at the beginning of my life thinking poets shouldn't teach, because I basically thought you had to do everything possible to show the fates, forces, gods, that your life was consecrated to art, and anything that distracted you from the pure stream of energy that was going to flow into your work was a mistake. So I made my living as a secretary, and well, it was easy in those years to get it was easy to get jobs. And I had a very curious academic, I didn't have an academic career. In any case, I got to the end of what I could do, it seemed, as a writer. I had written one book. I had long since ceased to take any pride in it, and I seemed unable to write anything else. And I was invited to do a poetry reading in northern Vermont. I was living at the time in Provincetown, which I hated, but it seemed pointless to leave because I could have gone anywhere and gotten the secretarial job anywhere, and I didn't want to just play pin the tail on the map. I wanted to wait until some place made a claim on me. So I went to northern Vermont, and the minute I got out of a car in this little village, Plainfield, I thought, I'm supposed to live here. I later figured out why that was so, but, and it was a colloquium. John Berryman was there. It was right before he died, and I wanted to go because he was a hero of mine, and I wanted to tell him how great I thought he was, which it turned out to be impossible to say to him, because he thought then you were actually just trying to use him. And at the party the third night, everyone was drunk, and two people said, "You should come here and teach." And for me, it was an epiphany. I thought, I can't write. I should try to do something else. And I said, yes. And then I realized later that these were just drunken English teachers. They weren't empowered to offer me a job. But I was, by then, intent. And it was Goddard College, a hippie school. Somehow or other, a job was made up for me 4 days before school started. And I moved up there, and for the first time, I unpacked my boxes. I had been traveling around, moving from house to house, different lives, and all my stuff in boxes. And I lived in a rooming house with a bathroom down the hall, and I walked by the side of the road in this rural, freezing cold place, and I thought I only liked cities and I liked warm climates. But I walked up the side of the highway to school. The minute I started teaching, I started writing, and it was a miracle. And I realized that my brain was just as happy thinking about someone else's work. I had been so afraid that if I saw people with talent, I would try to suppress their gifts, but enviously, I would give them bad advice. But that turned out not to be the case. I mean, I felt passionate about my students' work, and they weren't all, though there's one woman in that first class who's now a really magnificent Canadian poet named Rue Borson. But oftentimes, students were not very good, especially at the beginning, and they did write poems of the sort that Peter is describing tactfully, hopeless poems. But if you could hear how they spoke in class, and if they could think critically, and if they said surprising things, then there was something in the brain that could be harnessed. And in each person, it was different. You tried to sniff out the genius in each person. And maybe someone would come in with a poem completely void of action or image, but it might be that that person wasn't going to get to those things the usual way. And part of the task was to figure out alternative approaches. Or is there a way to turn that sort of thing into a piece of magic? And over and over and over, you're dealing with different kinds of problems. And I learned things I would never have learned just sitting at my desk, looking at my white paper with my seashells and beautiful objects that were supposed to fill my head with, good thoughts. And when I spent 10 years editing first book prizes, which is how I met Peter and Dana Levin also. And these were some of the most extraordinary experiences of my life, just to see these talents. And it was a marvel to me that the books had been left for me to find because they seemed so transparently extraordinary. I didn't understand why others hadn't pounced long before, but I was really happy to get credit for it. There were times that were very painful, like after I judged the second contest that I judged. The book that year was The Clerk's Tale by Spencer Reese, an amazing book which changed a great deal as we worked on it. And we developed a very odd, close relationship. And Spencer was coming to visit. I think we'd never met. And he was staying with friends, and the friend came to pick him up, and I'd found my evening with Spencer torture, as he did too. He never looked up, but he must have looked up when I looked down, but we never looked at each other. And so then the friend comes, and it's an enormous relief. The friend talks like a human, looks at me, and he says, so you now don't write, you're just mentoring. And I wanted to say, get out of my house, but I didn't. I said, well, I hope that's not true. This was a long time ago. But I thought, well, my ego can take that, because what I get out of this is really quite amazing. And teaching was like that too. But you're trying to figure out where the gift is, and then in figuring it out with another person who has different capabilities and different passions than do you, you also learn something for yourself.
Yeah.
So
that maybe explains to me the amazing shifts in strategy, the way that your books seem yours, but also as if you've reinvented your project, with each one.
Well.
And I think that was evident through the reading tonight. Yeah.
We're at zero. Yeah. We're actually at 0.00, and we may have gotten there a while ago and not noticed.
No, it was just a few minutes ago. But okay. I guess I just wanted to close by, thanking you for reading and for.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Peter
has been a real muse.
And likewise.
Yeah, we'll continue this later.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
You just